So I've been getting notes and messages from a lot of folks and trying to respond to them. I've been trying to respond to the comments, and again, I'll do this for as long as I have stamina and time and energy. And we're coming into the holiday season, so who knows what will happen. But I'm here right now, and I said before, I'm with this kind of stuff, I'm kind of a rabbit. When I'm on it, I'm on it. But I could disappear tomorrow and stop making videos because I'm on to something else, or I could start making videos about someone else besides Jordan Peterson. But I've been on this for about 6 months, so we'll see how long it goes. But as I was reflecting on many of my conversations on email, in the comment section, on Hangouts, on texting, all of this, there were some things that I wanted to say generally to, again, subscribers and the rest of you, that, just to let you know, if you contact me, these are the kind of things I'm going to be saying, because this is what I think, and this is where my heart's at. The question is how a church might be a critical place for sorting yourself out. Now, many in this group have given up on religion, are deeply skeptical about religion, and I completely respect that. And truth be told, I totally understand that. Again, I spoke about one of the professors of mine, John Steck at Calvin Seminary, was one of my favorite profs. He was an Old Testament prof. He had a hand in the translation of the New International Version, and he once made a comment in class. He said, people come up to me with their NIV and say, oh, I don't like how this psalm is translated, and he would tell them, you have one complaint about this. I have hundreds of complaints about the translation. We do it as a committee, and I feel that way about church. If you have some recollection of church in your childhood and you remember its flaws, or you went to one church and a pastor didn't do well by you, or the church hurt you somehow, and probably could very well be in some horrible ways, or Christian theology harmed you, or this all leaves a bitter taste in your mouth, I totally get that, because I live in this realm and I see it. And I'll let you know something that's even worse. It's more comfortable in some senses that when bad things happen, it's somebody else's fault. It's really bad when it's your fault, or it's the fault of your tribe. Those are hard things to take on your conscience, on your heart. And so if anybody knows the flaws of churches, it's usually pastors, and we have all our own ideas about it. And so it's a big deal. But yeah, as I contemplate this whole Jordan Peterson thing, I think for a lot of people, and again, if you ask me, say, well, Pastor, what do you think of this and what do you think of that? I'll give you an answer if I've got time. But one of the things that I'm recognizing through this strange thing called YouTube and the internet is that y'all are spread all over the world. And there's maybe some folks here in Sacramento that are gonna come down to Living Stones, and there might even be one or two people that say, boy, I'd like to join your crazy little church, and nothing would please me more. A church like ours, there's always more room for more. But what you begin to realize is, and if you say visit on a Sunday, is you begin to realize that, well, church is a lot more complicated than looking at PVK's face on my phone or on my computer. That there's lots of people in church. And again, according to Jordan Peterson, and I think he's dead on right, people are, chimps filled with snakes. And that's the same true at Living Stones, at any church. And so I completely understand why it's comfortable to stay in your office, or stay in your mama's basement, or stay in your bedroom and lock the door and just watch YouTubes all day. Well, yeah, that's a good way to waste your life. C.S. Lewis, one of C.S. Lewis's first commercially successful book was the Screwtape Letters. And if you want to read a fascinating book that is full of wisdom, it's fairly early in C.S. Lewis's Christian career. But Screwtape Letters is, basically it's the dialogue between a senior devil and a junior devil, and the senior devil is giving the junior devil advice basically on how to snare people. And one of the ways that the senior devil says is, keep them busy on distractions, and just distract them, distract them, distract them, distract them all the way down. Now, to your credit, I'm sure you're still watching cat videos, but you're watching, if you're watching Jordan Peterson, you're watching meaty stuff, and you're thinking through things, and you're working the angles, and you're trying to sort yourself out, because someplace deep inside of you, you know that something is wrong. And so here is a thinker who's engaging you, and it's making you think, and it's making you question. Well, all of that thinking and questioning, if that doesn't get you out of your mother's basement, if that doesn't get you into a real relationship, if that doesn't get you in what I call meat space, MEET or MEAT, if that doesn't really get you out into the world, it's just a game. And so here's the thing. You go to a church, oh baby, it's a world of chimps and snakes and petty people and ideas, and what makes church doubly difficult is that everyone's running around in church violating the third commandment. Now, what do I mean by that? You probably don't have the 10 commandments memorized. The third commandment, depending on, again, how you count them, is thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. Well, what does that mean? Well, one of the ways I interpret it is, I have a feeling, and I say, this is what God says. Well, you're taking your ideas and you're signing God's name behind them. I think that's a violation of the third commandment. I think, if you're a conservative believer and you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, well, then let God speak for Himself, and that's plenty difficult. Never mind, pronouncing this. And as a pastor, this is a deep liability for me, because I stand up there on the pulpit and I tell people what the Bible says, and that. Well, the Bible itself says those who teach will be judged more critically. Those who teach will have to, again, this is all within the Christian frame, but those who teach will have to stand before the throne of God and account for what they taught. And so, if you see a pastor out there, mucking up the job, one of the things that you can have in your mind is, well, if this pastor believes all this stuff, he's going to be asked to give an account before God of what he did with his mouth. That's a terrifying thought. So, yeah, church might be a critical place for you to sort yourself out. Disappointment with church. Again, you're not telling me anything new with this. When I moved to Sacramento, I met a guy down the street, and he became one of my best friends here in town. And we got to know each other a little bit. And then he asked me what I did, because that's what guys always ask. And I told him I was a pastor. and what I love about my friend is that he's blunt. And he says, pastors are kingdom builders. They build their own kingdoms. And he's right. So many pastors out there, their one abiding interest is make my church large. Because if my church can be large, I can have status. I can maybe get my face on the cover of Christianity Today. I can have a bigger salary. I can have a bigger home. And if you think money and security and all of those things don't tug at pastors' hearts, well, you're naive, because pastors are people too, and all of those things tug at our hearts. So you've got a balance between this naive or cynicism, because also in my experience, many pastors I know, they deal with all these things, but that's not why they're in it. Because right now in American culture, you're not going to get wealthy being a pastor. And pastor is currently, at least outside of some religious subcommunities, pastor is not a high status job. But yes, absolutely. Many pastors are kingdom builders, and they're out there trying to build their own kingdom. Churches just want to indoctrinate you into sheeple, so that you can give wool and mutton to their selfish tribal goals. Absolutely, this is true. And I see it all the time. I listen to pastors, I watch pastors, and a lot of time I think, I would never join your church. I wouldn't join your church if they paid me. I'd sit at home and watch idiots on YouTube or Christian TV before I join your church, because at least they can't reach out and grab me. So yeah, this is true, and this is going on in the church world. Christianity is legacy code, and some of the Brett Weinstein stuff in the Joe Rogan video. Christianity is legacy code, some of which can be saved, but isn't sufficiently moral nor nimble for our time. That's huge. That's a huge statement, and a statement really worthy of interacting with. And Peterson's got some interesting things to say about that in terms of feeding off the dead, and I think there's an element of truth to that. And I'm not going to get into this one too deeply, but I just want to recognize it and say that there's a lot of truth to that. But what you very quickly get into is, so on one hand you've got that perspective, on the other hand you've got C.S. Lewis's perspective, which is of chronological snobbery, where we believe that anything new is better. But see, we don't really believe that, because then we have all these other sayings in our language, like old school, and we revere old things, and we collect antiques. And so that is a much more complicated reality than is easily dealt with. But there is a lot of truth to that. And I'm gonna have an analogy of that coming in. Well, why might a church be a helpful place for you to sort yourself out? And one of the first things is that you have limited time. And you have limited time. Now, I'm in my 50s right now, and one of the things that blows me away is how quick it went. And the truth is, the older you get, the faster it goes. And so you do have limited time. And so get to work, bucko. Cyberspace is ether. The meat space is where real, embodied, actual life happens. And it's the difference between porn and relationship with a real person. Pornography, yeah, you're going to get off, there you have it. But you're not actually going to build a life. And so, and again, getting into it, I know a lot of people who will, this is still in the elements of the United States that are Christ haunted, and these elements are diminishing and shrinking, and now there's a lot more people who are spiritual but not religious, so on and so forth. Many people say, well, I'm a Christian but I don't go to church, and for many years churches focused on those kinds of groups for their evangelistic outreach. Those groups are declining because younger groups are growing up, and they're nuns, and I don't mean N-U-N-S, I mean N-O-N-E-S, and they're more cynical, and they're working through these things, and a lot of it is, well, I want a religion that suits me, so I'm going to make up my own religion. Well, that's nice, but imagine and we do this all the time, I tell myself stories about my health, or I tell myself stories about my relationships. And in many ways, you need to tell yourself stories because you inhabit these stories, and you can't live without these stories that you inhabit. But at some point, these stories are going to have to make contact with the real world. And so then the question is, where will these stories make contact with the real world? And they make contact with the real world in relationships. Tim Keller often says, in crunchy relationships, in relationships that say no to you, in relationships that have limits, in relationships that have unresolvable difficulties that there is no way to deal with. As a pastor, and as a pastor of a number of people who are older, one of the things I can tell you is that, again, this is irrefutable, as you get older, I call it the age of decay, your body is going to break down, and you're no longer going to be able to do what your 20 or 30 something body could do. And there are going to be medical things that come into your life. There are going to be relational things that come into your life. There are going to be people who disappoint you. But the worst things are the things that the ways that you fail other people. And again, this is part of the reason I really enjoy Peterson, because Peterson understands that, when we say, yeah, people are chimps full of snakes, that means I am a chimp full of snakes. That boy, I am dangerous. And one of the things that bothers me about YouTube is, you sit across the screen and you see my face and you see my books and you hear my voice, and gosh, he sounds like a nice guy. Boy, I could, if you're vulnerable, I can disappoint you. And, I could give you a list of people I've disappointed in my life. And I'm pastor of a small church. I am not perfect. I know my capacities for evil. And even and that's just the capacities for when I really mess up and do things morally wrong. How about those capacities of when I just am a bumbler and I hurt people by accident and there's misunderstandings? There's a world of hurt out there. But the truth is, you're only actually going to get better in that world, not by imagining that, oh, I would be great at this or this would be wonderful, but by actually getting out and doing it. And actually, I think this is at the heart of Peterson's message about responsibility. And this, I think, is why he's getting traction. And I think this is why he's worth listening to. So these screens distort our biological calibrators. These, you can pull up your phone and you can adjust the settings and you make yourself look more beautiful. And this is what Facebook is doing. This is what YouTube is doing. If we're going to use a tool like this, we make our peace with the limitations and distortions. And I'm doing that right now. And like I said before, there might, 2-3 weeks from now, a month from now, I might look at this and say, I'm done with this. And I stop making videos. I might even say, I don't want this disruption in my life. And I take them all down. And I close down my Facebook account. And I close down my Twitter account. And I just say, I'm going to live in plain old 24/7 physical meat space. And if you want to come see me, you got to walk through that door of Livingstone's church at a Sunday morning and shake my hand and look me right in the eye. Because until that, I don't trust you, monkeys filled with snakes. If you're reaching out to me through electronic media, I need to look you in the eye. One of my favorite, one of my favorite professors at Calvin Seminary, his name was Spud Snapper, and he looked like a gremlin, but he was a wise old guy, and he would just sit there in front of class and he'd talk, and sometimes he would just say, I gotta smell their breath. Now that was obviously a reference to alcoholism, but there's no substitution for looking someone in the eye in real time and space. And if we're using these tools and, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, any of these social medias, television, if we're using these tools and we're not cognizant of that reality, we do so at our peril. And part of the benefit of being someone my age is I remember the day, not before television, but I remember the day before cell phones and the internet. And I, and I'm not alone in this. A number of insightful watchers are nervous about what this means. And so, at least in the Christian community, one of the big things that's happening, Andy Crouch has just written a book, I haven't read it, on parenting, limiting their children's cyber diets, limiting screen time. This is going to be the challenge for us moving forward, because this stuff is so powerful. You need a real life. You're going to need a real spouse. You're going to need real kids. You're going to need real friends. You're going to need limits on you. You're going to have to be married to someone who's going to have, at some points, insane or irresponsible or incoherent fears and trials, and you're going to have to deal with it, because that's what it means to deal with real people. Are they right? No. But are there relationships? I mean, it's maybe you've only had to deal with parents this way. Are there relationships impinging on you in irrational ways that you can't immediately dispense with? Probably. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to blow up your world? Now, some of you are the products of worlds that have been blown up. Some of you have parents who couldn't take it and left, and the legacy of that, and that's rough. And some of you are the victims of this in church. And again, I'm not sugarcoating any of this. Churches are a place filled with chimps full of snakes, and they're even worse because they're signing God behind their own, half-baked cockamamie ideas that they're promoting and marching through the archetypal stuff and saying, here's my idea blown large. Oh, baby, there's nothing more dangerous than that. So, or maybe I should have said bucko. but you need a real life. There's no substitution for that. A real spouse, real kids, real friends, real limits on you. And this cuts down on, again, I think this is an excellent point by Peterson when he's deconstructing the postmoderns with respect to literature and text. This it's all of this real stuff that limits us. So this is my argument for church. Do churches need reforming? Always. Churches are always in need of reform, and churches are always reforming. And if you know anything about church history, churches are always changing and adjusting to the time. Now there's something that's kind of like the situation of Microsoft right now in this moment. Microsoft took over the world with x86 machines and DOS, and then was competing with Apple for Windows. And now Microsoft is competing with Android and iOS and other platforms, and Android is trying to have Windows 10, and they're trying to catch up on these things, and they're trying to have Windows 10s. A fair number of you are nerdy about computers, so you probably know about that. And it seems like a losing battle, but yet you cannot ignore Microsoft in the computing world, and the church is kind of in that place that churches grew up in their moment, and so some of the legacies of those moments endure, and so there's always a lag going on in churches. Now there are liabilities to that lag, but there's also wisdom to that lag, because one of the let's say the day Apple produces puts out its new operating system, you have your old iPhone 6, bang, you download that new operating system. What happens to your phone? Well, the first edition has all these bugs, and your phone gets slow, and before you know it, you want to march out to the Apple Store, who is a hardware company, which explains a lot of this. You want to march out to that Apple Store and say, I need a new iPhone because your new operating system just made my phone slow as molasses. Now, yeah, this is what's happening. And so, if you come to a little church like mine, one of the very few Google comments about my church was my favorite. Full of love, a little outdated. Yeah, a little. Way outdated, but as you well know, in church world, sometimes way outdated, such as, let's say, the Orthodox or the Roman Catholic. The Orthodox Church is kind of the oldest of these. That outdatedness has its own appeal because, again, things that endure have been tried. And I don't mean, in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, but generations, multiple generations, hundreds of years, thousands of years, things that have endured. One of my favorite ideas about endurance is ontology is its own justification. If something continues to exist, well, there's a reason it's continued to exist. And if you get into church, we've had a proliferation of a ton of new music for the last 40, 50 years in church. And this is an enormous blessing. But one of the things that you notice is that there's certain hymns that continue to be well known and loved, and in a sense, in a Darwinian sense, those hymns have survived the evolution. And all this new music that's come out, most of that is going to be laid to the side, and a few things will emerge, and then 100 years from now, someone will go back into this stuff, and they'll find some hidden gems that didn't make the cut, but are right for that moment, and they'll come out. And so, the church, like the rest of life, is this incredibly dynamic situation where all of these things are going on. Do we know how to do church? No. A big part of my career in Sacramento has been working with church plants. And I'm of the opinion that the church continues to be needing to plant new churches. And those church plants are experiments, and a lot of those experiments fail. But what happens in those church plants is that we continue to figure out how to do new things and figure out how to adapt the church for our context. Tim Keller wrote a paper 10, 15 years ago. You can find it on the internet. Just Google Tim Keller church planting paper. And he basically makes the point that church plants continue to revive the church and renew the church. But again, this is a very evolutionary process. And I know church has tons of legacy code. Well, the reason the church has so much legacy code is because we're always writing new code, because we're always doing theology. And actually the process of theology is a very living process, but it's enormously messy and it's enormously long. There are issues right now that the church is trying to sort out, issues of gender equality. What's the role of women in the church? LGBT questions and the church. And what you tend to find is, you've got early adopters, you've got people with tons of legacy code, and right now in the moment you might say, I want the church to mirror my ideas right now. Okay, well, that's called a mirror. And the church finally won't offer that, because you will finally be a church of one, and you will stay at home in your mom's basement looking at me talking to you about this and watching YouTube. So, you've got to get out there. You've got to be part of the game. And like Peterson says, it's a world of chaos out there, and the church is a chaotic world. But if you want to talk about God and the Bible and philosophy and physics, and if you want it to be scalable, before this I've got my rough draft on Sunday video that I just did on for my Christmas Eve message that I'll be giving this Sunday. It's always changing. It's enormously dynamic. And this is, to me, where the Christian faith comes in, because part of what the Christian faith offers me is a belief that, and I know trust me, all you agnostic and atheist people, I so get your point. And there are days when, I'd be like, oh, baby, yeah, I'm ready to chuck the whole thing and join y'all, and so on and so forth. And plenty of people have done it. Just Google Bart Campolo and the journey he's made. There's a terrific video out there. There's so many terrific videos of a conversation, I think it was from Youth Specialties, of Bart Campolo and Tony Campolo. They wrote a book together about Bart's deconversion and Tony's struggling with that. Oh boy, that video is beautiful, because all of the relationships, father, son, all of that stuff comes into that video. So for my atheist and agnostic friends and viewers, and those of you who are post-Christian or New Agers or what have you, I get how crazy Christianity is. I really do. And again, if you look at my sermons, I talk about this fairly often. Jesus, at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and people come to me and say, "Oh, Pastor, I don't know about the virgin birth." And I say, virgin birth? Here's a guy who stands up on a mountain at the end of the Gospel of Matthew and says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And this was just last week in my Sunday school class, and I asked him, I said, if I stood up in front of you in Sunday school class and said, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me," they laughed. Of course they laughed. It's absolutely ridiculous. And for me to say it is obviously absolutely ridiculous. But Christianity, this gets into C.S. Lewis's argument. You can find it in Mere Christianity. Christianity follows a man who says stuff like this. Well, how crazy is that? But again, to get back into N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of Son of Man, not only did he say stuff like this, now, okay, debate, scholars like maybe Bart Ehrman are going to say, well, he couldn't have said something like this because we wanted to believe that Jesus was sane and that this was embellishment of the apostles. I'm not so sure. So he says stuff like this. Well, what am I supposed to think about that? What am I supposed to do about that? Well, where can I work on this stuff? I can sit in my basement and think any thought I want. I can sit in my basement and declare to the pipes, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me." I'm declaring it to the pipes. Sit in a room of people who know you. I've been at this church 20 years. These people know me. they know when it's a bad sermon. They've got ideas. They're polite and they're nice, so they might not tell me, but they know all this stuff. And when you have a spouse or children, it's all the same thing. And so the real contest is not in our imagination, this beautiful mind that we've been given that can imagine things. And again, some of that stuff that Jordan Peterson talks about is really helpful in that. But it's out there with real people. And so, how do we know how to do it? We don't. We don't know how to do church. We're mucking around in it. And, like the Orthodox or the Roman Catholics that have long histories, they're working through those same things all the time. Now, why bother with church? It's the ultimate meat space delivery system, I think, in some ways, to talk about these things. In the secular West, there is so much freedom. One of the things, I'll try and say his name. We connected on Twitter, John Paggio. There was even debate in the comment section if that's the way to say it. If I ever talk to him on Skype or something, I'm going to try and learn how to say his name right. But the Orthodox Church, I read an article recently so you have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, you've got these Orthodox communities, in the ancient world, in the place where Christianity first went. The point of this article is that when these churches came to America, these churches have been flourishing in a way in America that they weren't flourishing in other places. The interesting, one of the religious arguments for classic Western liberalism is, and I mean classical liberalism, not progressivism. I want to distinguish those two ideas. Is that in many ways religion has flourished here. Now that's a hugely complicated thing. I was just listening to Dale Van Clay, a former professor of mine, incredibly brilliant man, terrific historian, wrote a piece about some of Brad Gregory's work. Now I'm getting pretty nerdy in terms of church history and Western history of secularism and all. But, this is complicated. This is complicated stuff. But the Orthodox Church, when they come to the United States and many of these other communities, they're just thriving. And there's something to that. There's something to this freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And part of what's a blessing in the United States is it's a mixed blessing, and it's a two-edged sword. But you can come into a church and you can say, boy, that Vander Clay up there, he's talking about this and talking about that. He's a nutcase. I looked around his church. I said, I don't want to be anywhere near this church. And you go out and you leave. Or maybe you grew up in a church and at some point you say, I don't want to be here anymore. And you walk out. You have the freedom to be post-Christian. And there is something deeply right about that the framers of the American system, which then, basically spread throughout the West, even countries in Europe that still formally have state churches, that they recognize. And you've got that benefit. So shop, baby. There's so much freedom, and there is so much legacy code, but turn that into an asset. Dig into the legacy code of a tradition. And again, I'm a subscriber to, in order to be a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, you have to sign, used to be called the form of subscription. And my church holds me, not just my local church, but the denomination holds me accountable to beliefs. Well, it's kind of like a marriage. You're held accountable to stuff that you might one day wake up and say, well, I don't know about that. Well, I don't know if I want to be part of this. And sometimes people get to the point of saying, I want a divorce from my church, and out I go. And so what you really have to do is you really have to work that matrix. Andy Crouch, I think, got it from Os Guinness. Here's a little tidbit of truth. Nothing happens without individuals, and nothing lasts without institutions. Both of those things are true. And so all of these ethereal, brilliant ideas of wisdom and theology that we might have, unless they, and this is something that I, think about in terms of, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon is a year and, a year and a half old since he got all this visibility. He's been working this stuff for a lot longer. But, some of the people I say, this is all a fad, this is all going to go away. It might. All the little Facebook groups and the sorters and all the YouTube channels might all just go away. So, okay, that might happen. And so if you really want to have an enduring presence and an enduring legacy and an enduring impact in your world, you have to engage with institutions. It might mean forming a new institution. It might mean coming into an institution. Things don't change without institutions. Nothing changes without individuals. You need the individual, but nothing lasts without institutions, because institutions travel through time and we are short-lived creatures. So if you ask me, one of the things I'll tell you is you need to shop for a church that you can tolerate. And I recommend Christian Reformed churches just because it's my tribe and I know those people, and I know the nature of snakes within them. So, and I wouldn't stay in my tribe if I didn't like my tribe. I know its flaws, trust me. I've managed to see a few other Christian Reformed people out there who are watching Jordan Peterson, so a shout out to you. And some people are shocked that a Christian Reformed minister would talk about this because, well, this goes into the fact that I have a small church. If I had a church of 1,000 people, this would be a lot more complicated for me. But I've got a small church, and we know each other quite well, and so they trust me, and they also know I tend to go on fads, and I tend to get obsessed with something for a few months, then I leave it and go on to something else. They're used to that. So you need to shop for a church that you can tolerate. And you need to pick one not because of its music. Now, I've got nothing against church music, but in terms of right now, the big box mega churches, which God bless them, again, I'm not going to speak against them either. A lot of people pick a church because they like the music. Well, that's great. Music is a really big and important part of church. But my guess is if you're listening to Jordan Peterson videos, you're probably you probably got high intelligence. You've probably, you care about this kind of stuff. And so you're probably, some of the people come to church because they like the music. Some of the people come to church because they want to hear the sermon. And you're probably over on the sermon side. So you're going to have to pay attention to the pastor, but not just the pastor. You're going to have to watch the church culture, because every church has a culture, and figure out if that church has enough flexibility and strength. One of the qualities of steel that makes it so useful is it's both strong and flexible. And churches need to be like that. They need to be strong and flexible. And so pay attention to the pastor, because the pastor is an expression of the church culture, and the pastor is often the steward of the church culture. But also pay attention to the people that are there. Are they strong yet flexible? And you might be surprised. You might think, well, in a liberal church, now I'm using liberal now on the left-right spectrum. On a church over on the left, I'll have more flexibility. And you might say, but this exactly gets into the Jordan Peterson political conversation, because, well, there's going to be some added flexibility in some things in liberal churches. I mean, they're not going to try and police your sex life. They're, going to be fine with any ideas that you have about evolution. Certain things they're not going to police. But again, if you've been watching this culture war unfold, there's other things that they're going to be highly intolerant of and highly rigid with. And so then if you go to conservative churches, well, part of the benefit of some conservative churches is at least you have a pretty good guess what they're going to police, because they've been policing these things for decades or hundreds of years. And so, if you can kind of live with those constraints or restraints, and, with churches, there's always the dynamic of, well, almost no church won't let you attend. When it comes to membership, things get a lot more complicated in churches, because members are people who have a say in the institutional life moving forward. And a lot of people say, well, if this church won't let me join, then I don't want to be part of it. Well, sometimes it's not bad to, and a lot of people who go to church have figured this out, and that's tough on pastors because getting people to join a church is sometimes hard. But a lot of people who go to church know that, well, nobody's going to stop you going through the door, and you're going to have relationships with people. You're going to gain all of the advantages of church life without membership. Now, membership is kind of, in some ways, it's kind of the difference between sleeping with your romantic partner and living with them versus marrying them. So if you actually get deeper into this, and I would certainly encourage it, then at some point you're going to have to think about membership. And then you're going to, religio Latin, to bind. And then in a sense, you're bound in there. And just as with marriage, sometimes some of the best learnings in life will be because you're bound to something and can't get out of it. I think of, Ulysses Contracts, which is where, Odysseus has his sailors bind him to the mast and then has them, plug up their ears and says, no matter what I say, don't let me off this mast. In a sense, religion is like that, because we're going through these oceans of chaos, and the wise know that what I feel like doing in the moment is not always wise. And again, some of the stuff in Maps of Meaning, when I first heard it, I thought, boy, that's brilliant, because what I'm always navigating is not just the me right now, but the me tomorrow, and the me the next day, and the me next day. And what binding, such as a religious commitment or a marriage vow, does is forces you to say, I have to consider not just what I feel like doing right now, but I have to consider what my grandchildren are going to think of me. I have to consider whether or not I'm going to drive a truck through the emotional world of my children by deciding to leave this marriage, which for the last few years has not been working in terms of giving me what I want. Those are the kinds of things that define you. And if you actually want to become a person of substance, these are the things you must endure. And again, look at the hero's journey. If you watched a movie where someone came out and they were beautiful and full of muscles and everything was great, you wouldn't watch that movie. What happens in the hero's journey? The hero suffers. The hero experiences loss. And if you actually want to be a hero, you're going to have to suffer. And I'll tell you, again, this is a Ulysses contract. If you're going to suffer, it's going to be because you are pinned in a corner and you can't get out. And now we're going to see what you're really made of. Can you stick with that relationship? Can you stick with that church? Can you stick with that marriage? Now, here's the thing. The relational consequences of leaving a church are less than leaving a marriage. And so in some ways, churches are sparring grounds where we toughen up, where we learn to differentiate, where we figure out what's me, what's you. Again, this old professor at Calvin Seminary, people would get upset with him because he'd say something they thought was theologically a little outside the bounds, and he'd just look at him with his gremlin smile and say, I don't have a problem. Do you have a problem? And this is all boundary stuff. And so what a church and real relationships and dealing with real theology and legacy code, what this does is forces us to get a hold of ourselves and start sorting ourselves out and living in the midst of an enormously complex world, much of which does not suit us, or we don't like, or we don't understand, or we'd love to run away with, but for the sake of greater things, we endure. And the book of Hebrews talks about this. The book of Hebrews talks about basically about Jesus looking at the goal and deciding to suffer and pay the price to get there. And that's, in fact, the entire story of the crucifixion, because Jesus could have easily talked his way out of Pilate's chamber. Pilate was practically begging him to give an excuse, and he doesn't. Why? Because he had the goal in mind. Again, it's the hero's journey. He had the goal in mind. He was going to suffer. And the thing about, again, churches are the biggest fandom around. If you're standing in line at Star Wars and you're dressing up like a character from Star Wars and you're going to go in and you're going to watch the movie, and it's going to be great fun, because in that moment you're living in your fandom. You're living in your universe. And that's awesome. Star Wars is a fun story, and Harry Potter is a fun story, and Lord of the Rings is a fun story. Well, you know what church is? Church is living in your fandom. And it's not just, when a new Star Wars movie comes out. And it's not just, limited by the ticket or the amount of friends that you can gather in. It's real stakes, and it's real life. And so you're living in the story of this crazy old book, and yeah, there's inconsistencies and there's rules that are ignored. And let me just be straight. The Bible is not a book of rules that if you obey them all, you go to heaven. that is the most low resolution common idea about what Christians and the Bible is. It is far from the case. It is far more the case that it is a story that we aspire to live into. And that is both the thrill and the torment of being a religious person. And you cannot be a religious, well, you're a wimpy religious person if you want to try to be religious, but you don't actually join a church and suffer. And so much of it, again, like they said about the army, so much of it is mundane. So much of it is boring. So much of it is, you think, oh gosh, can't they do better than this? But it is exactly that common space where God creates in us and creates us to be the kinds of people that human beings are capable of being. Now, maybe you think God is an idea, and this is one of the big issues I really want to get on in terms of Jordan Peterson. Is God an idea? That I talked about this in the commentary to the second biblical series. Is God an idea that is caused by us, or are we material creatures that are caused by God? And if you really want to test this out, now maybe as a child or maybe you had a span of time that it didn't work out, well, maybe it's time to try again. And maybe now you've got you're a far better differentiated person. You're far more mature. You've got way more assets and you've got way more strength with which to engage this. Maybe you can wander into a church. Maybe you can, do some church shopping and find places. Again, if you contact me and there are, if I know pastors in your region and you want a recommendation, if I can give you one, I gladly will, because I'm a minister and I'm fairly well known in my denomination, at least by pastors. I'll give you a recommendation and I'll give you an honest take that I might have. But get into a real relationship. And put on the costume and stand in line and go in the theater and sit next to someone that has bad breath or with a crying child or find a church where the people are good as gold but the pastor is boring and dry as dust. My grandfather, I mentioned I'm a third generation Christian Reformed minister. From what I've been able to tell, my grandfather was an exceedingly boring preacher. In fact, I heard a story recently that he was, this is back in the day when they would call a minister basically on a note in a yearbook and seeing how long he was in a church. And they called him to a church and then he visited the church and he preached for them. And they tried to undo his call. And my grandfather was wise and patient and godly. But he was also, he was not to be cowed by a church council. And he said, well, because he knew the church order, something that church council and church people were bound to, and he said, well, I'll consider that. And he went to the church, and I can imagine their elders being just completely frustrated that this man would come, but they paid him and they put him in the parsonage. And within a few months, they began to discover his quality, because he genuinely knew how to love people and he genuinely knew how to care for people. And by the time he retired, that was the last church he served, by the time he retired, they loved him dearly. His sermons didn't get any better, but they enjoyed him and they knew who he was and they knew what he could do. See, I always forget to turn off my phone for these things. So that's why mature Christians stay in sometimes boring, dysfunctional, terrible churches, because here's the crazy thing. Here's the crazy thing about suffering in this world. Suffering can make you bitter, or suffering can make you golden. The Bible repeatedly uses the image of being refined by fire. Fire can destroy you, or fire can make you amazing. And this is what C.S. Lewis gets into. And, so some of you have asked about my Calvinism. Well, Calvinism basically says that, God, here's one way to think about it. God makes saints out of the most surprising people. And you right now might be, in the minds of everyone who knows you, a complete loser. And God could do incredible things through you. And I believe that's what's at the heart of Calvinism, that It's finally God doing his work, and God empowering us to do crazy great things. So once you commit, work the impossible matrix of commitment. And again, marriage is one of the best examples of this. You here's the crazy thing about marriage. You stand, in our culture, we marry people that we love. Other cultures, your parents pick your spouses, and it's a very interesting conversation to figure out which is better. And I tell this and to any couple that I marry, you stand in front of the altar and you look at the other person, you think, I love you forever, I'll love you for always, I'll never leave you. And 5 years from now, they might be your enemy. And Jesus says to love your enemy. And you've got to learn to love that person who, in that moment, you might despise. But here's the matrix of marriage. If you keep working at it, you might discover you can learn to love that person. And you might discover even some of the things that you thought you hated about them, you begin to love. Just like initially, some of the things that you loved about them, you grew to hate. And so commitment is that way. And commitments are important. Lou Smedes was a Christian Reformed minister, taught at Calvin College and then taught at Fuller Theological Seminary, wrote some terrific books about forgiveness. And one of the things that I was a student at Calvin Seminary. He was by that point already an old man. He gave a lecture at Calvin Seminary about commitment, and in many ways that changed my life. I remember sitting down to go to Calvin Seminary. You had to do a psych eval, and so you fill out all these things, and that's why I recommend the Christian Reformed Church, because it's a credible institution. They evaluate their ministers. Ministers are held accountable. It's not a foolproof way of making sure a turd isn't a minister, or that ministers stay on track. But it's not bad. At least there's accountability. So I'm getting my psych eval, and I'm a young kid. I'm skeptical of psychology and all this stuff, and I filled out all these crazy surveys with trying to look for the psychotics and the sociopaths and all that, the ones that really do write the crazy answers on those psych tests. And I'm sitting down with the shrink, and the shrink basically says to me, probably what you need to do next is you need to make a commitment in your life and stick with it. And about that time I was dating someone, and I made a commitment, and I've been married almost 30 years. And marriage is a hell of a thing. Because here's the thing, I'm not the same person I was. Lou Smedes has this line. Lou Smedes once stood up in front of an audience and said, I've been married to 5 different women, or and he said, and all of them are the same person. I think I got that wrong, but you understand what I meant. Marriage is a hell of a thing, because you have to learn to love someone where both of you are changing, and to figure out how to do that is not a small thing. But if you can manage that, I'm not trying to demoralize anyone who failed at that. If you've got more time, figure out what went wrong. Figure out where to take your life next. Figure out how to sort it out. Because the worst thing is people who are married once and they never sort out anything, and they do the same thing again in the second marriage. And I've known people who've done that 2, 3, 4 times. One dear saint at this church that I buried a number of years ago, I didn't know it, but because she never told me. She didn't want me to know. She had been married 4 times. But by the time I knew her, she was a godly, dear saint who was an amazing woman. So, don't... John Piper, Reformed pastor, says, don't waste your sufferings. And he's exactly right. Well, for many of us, the only way we're going to suffer is if we make a commitment and we work on sticking to those commitments. And again, that's Jordan Peterson. Find something hard, lift something heavy. You've got to do it. So that's what was on my mind today. And again, I'm playing around with this. I'm doing it because I'm just doing it. And if I say something wrong and someone unsubscribes, well, I follow a master who none of his disciples, except John, who was probably a young man, and so the soldiers wouldn't look at him, his disciples were hiding while he was being tortured and killed by their enemies. His disciples were hiding. And you can read, if you read the Gospels closely, you can see that, this left its mark on Peter. And then at the end of John, when Jesus has his disciples together, and Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" And of course, what he was saying is, Peter, who was the one who had said, "I'll never leave you, I'll die with you." When the soldiers came and Jesus wouldn't let them use violence, which is, of course, what they wanted to use, and Jesus heals the ear of the servant of the high priest, and his disciples flee, and Jesus dies alone. His disciples had to sort themselves out after that. I was watching a thing on Face the Nation recently that had a group of presidential historians talking about their work, and one of the things that all of them noted was, all of many of these heroes in our history suffered failure. So if you botched up a marriage, if you are living in your mom's basement, if you couldn't get through school, if you are a mess in relationships, if you've got cancer because you smoked all those years, if you have life, you have hope. And the way to get on a different track is to get out of your mom's basement and to start lifting something heavy, and to, here I'm on YouTube telling you to turn off YouTube, and to get out there in real life, to get a real relationship, to work on your relationship with your siblings or your parents or your children, to join a church that you can tolerate, that you have some indication that the people are in some way healthy, and the pastor isn't a charlatan, and for whatever reason you have to believe that that's true, get out there and get into the game. Because, again, I'm a Christian minister. I'm going to use God talk, because God can do things through you, and I surely believe that because I've seen it. So I don't know how to classify this one. Again, I'm just talking to the silly computer, and y'all are just as silly because you're listening. But there we have it. And but get out there and do something. If you want to explore God and you want to explore the Bible, find a church you can tolerate. And if you contact me, I'll probably point you to a Christian Reformed church, because I'm that. The Reformed Church of America, they're close to me theologically, but there are many, many good pastors of many, many denominations, and I'm not going to talk about other religions because that's not my place. But yeah, find a good church, find a good pastor, build a relationship, find a church that will disciple you. A church that will hold you accountable, and submit to their accountability, if it's sane. There are abusive churches out there, and I think of some churches, I always get nervous when a lot of churches talk a lot about authority. On one hand, they've got a point. On the other hand, I've seen churches that talk a lot about authority get very abusive. And so, again, you're going to have to figure all that stuff out. And so talk to people, get good advice, read, pray, work it through. But again, the only way you're gonna get anywhere is if you're actually working it in meat space, in real time, in real space. Okay, I'm gonna turn this off. Thanks for watching.